Welcome to the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Malvin. For those who don't know me, I'm a birth worker, a life coach, hypnotist, and a former liberal feminist turned radical truth teller. On this podcast, I expose the forces at play attempting to control our minds and bodies, such as transgender ideology, pornography, prostitution, and so much more. Together, we'll untangle patriarchal lies as you listen to jaw-dropping interviews with women from around the world. Warning, while listening to this podcast, you might find yourself triggered or perhaps notice where you've been biting your tongue on the issues that matter most to you. In my coaching and hypnosis, I help women and men stop getting triggered by every single thing, cultivate resilience, stop unwanted behaviors, and increase self-confidence. You can book your first session at whosebodyisit.com, and you can find that link in the episode show notes. And I just want to say that it's because of your endless support that I'm able to interview amazing women, get their stories out, and produce regular episodes for you. So with that being said, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. And if you're listening in, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And also consider making a financial contribution via the link in my show notes. You can also visit my activist sticker shop. My pro-woman stickers have the power to intercept transhumanist programming. So take a photo of your stickers out in the wild and tag me on Instagram at Whose Body Is It. Without further ado, let's get into this week's story. In today's episode, Emma tells her story of being groomed into transgender ideology at the Rhode Island School of Design. Emma says she could, quote, fill the bingo card of all the things that make you vulnerable to trans ideology: history of eating disorders, bisexuality, and surviving sexual abuse, to name a few. When Emma first encountered gender ideology, she was skeptical and even argued for women's sex-based rights. But when she entered the full-time academic environment of an elite art school, she was encouraged to hate her body and to believe all her problems would go away if she could become male. Almost as quickly as she fell under the spell of trans ideology, she realized she would never, no matter what she did to her body, transform into a man. Emma touches on the curious phenomenon of white middle-class women becoming non-binary and how she traces her identity confusion to her own adoption. As a bonus, you'll get to hear some of our cringy, RISD art school stories before we became deprogrammed. Emma also shares alternatives to medicalization, which are relevant to anyone battling dissociation and disembodiment. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you for a number of reasons. I would say, firstly, because we went to the same college, we went to the same conservatory, and we overlapped 1 year. So you were saying that I was a senior when you were a freshman at the Rhode Island School of Design in 2013. But when I was there, there was one woman I knew who identified as queer, but she was just a lesbian. Like, everybody knew it. And so did she. It wasn't a fancy way of saying bisexual. It was just, she was just a lesbian. But yeah, this hadn't totally taken off. The trans stuff hadn't taken off, at least among my peer group or anyone I knew at the time. But then 2014, when I moved back to New York, felt like everything had shifted. So should we start pre-RISD?
That's a tough one. Pre-RISD, yeah, I had a pretty typical childhood. I would say when people do interviews like this, sometimes they want to know, like, did you have like a trans childhood? And I think everyone could have a trans childhood if they wanted to. Everyone could rewrite their story. I just did a lot of after school activity is very typical of my gender. I was pretty conforming. I did ballet, gymnastics, ice skating, all those good things. Um, Went to an all girls school. If we're looking at like red flags of stuff that led me to be vulnerable to gender ideology, it was probably adoption was the beginning, having kind of a rocky sense of reality and identity around that, especially because in the 90s, when kids were being adopted, parents were definitely told, you're getting a fresh potato, you're getting, blank slate. And
Mm.
that isn't really the case. We're finding infants who are adopted are having similar issues to young people that were adopted, and it's the trauma of being ripped away from your mother. So I think that if I had to put my finger on, the beginnings of it, it would be there. And then I had like a kind of like I filled the bingo card up of all of the things you have to be careful for becoming vulnerable to gender ideology, like sexual trauma, sexual abuse, like grooming at like 14, 15, 16, 17, that the formative years. Eating disorder, gymnastics leading to like not wanting to go through a female puberty. It really was just like tick all the boxes. But when I went to RISD, it was that I had never heard or been exposed to any of that stuff. My freshman year, it wasn't even in the zeitgeist then. My freshman year, we had one trans student, and it wasn't widely accepted. The student really had to fight to make space for themselves. I will say that this student also was my first encounter being uncomfortable with trans women, because they would come to parties and loudly demand where the lesbians were, in a very male way. And I was very uncomfortable, and none of us felt like we could say anything. So all of that, and then I just happened to be in the perfect place through RISD, which I have complicated feelings about RISD, and I'd like to also hear your experience with that. It's a tough environment. It's a very ego-driven environment. It's also psychologically, I didn't find a lot of support for the psychological problems a lot of the students were having.
Mm.
Um, and it kind of, I mean, it felt a little bit like a free for all. I mean, it is college, you are like out on your own for the first time, but I mean, it's a collection of very talented, very unique people, which can lead to some chaos. But I had a normal freshman year there. I had a normal sophomore year there. And then my junior year, I had been just like drinking a little too much and fallen into pushing myself really hard in classes and doing too much work, but also partying too hard, and developed some addiction issues that were not being addressed. And then I went through a really traumatic breakup with my first like real girlfriend. And I was at the very end of that breakup where I was starving myself again because, well, partially because that school was a hotbed of eating disorders, and also because I just was so sad. I was just so depressed, and I was wearing her clothing. She was a butch lesbian, like I was wearing all of like boys' clothes. I had shaved my head because I felt really responsible for a lot of the things that went wrong in that relationship. And it was at that time when I was vulnerable. I was addicted to substances, but hadn't acknowledged it yet because half of them were prescription. And it was at that time that my therapist was like, "Hey, have you ever considered that you might be like?" I was coming to the therapist, the school counselor, saying, "I don't want to be a woman." Because I was feeling the weight of it all. I was what, 19, and just like starting to fully understand for the first time, like getting talked over in class by my male peers, being vulnerable physically to men, being treated like the inequality I never saw when I went to an all-girls school. It wasn't until I got into the real world that I was like, oh, this kind of sucks. So in my very juvenile way, I was saying, I don't want to be a woman. This is hard. This is painful. This is scary. And my therapist was like, oh, we can fix that now. Because gender ideology had already taken root within psychology at the time. So being despondent as I was, being not sober as I was like, oh, you have a solution to this pain, like this lifelong pain. Okay, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I am LGBT. Like I have struggled a little bit with that my whole life, being bisexual and loving women. And like there is an innate gender role, like playing with gender roles that happens in women loving women spaces because that's just kind of how it's been historically. Um, and I can't even tell you the number of times I've fallen in love with a straight girl only for her to say, like, if only you were a guy, like that has to have gotten in there somewhere.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so I was just very susceptible. It was like the perfect storm. So she referred me to an endo within like 6 months. I was very despondent. I look back at pictures now and I was like not home. I was not, there was nothing there. And I think I wanted to punish myself on some like subliminal level, but I trusted the doctor. I trusted the doctor. I went to the wrong doctors for help. I went to the wrong doctors for help. And then the social environment I was in gave me a second chance. So I'd been this like party girl that like pissed some people off, I'm sure, not living my best life. Definitely needed AA instead, found that later. That's a whole other part of my story I want to talk about because that's kind of how I got to the healing part. And then you know, you get this doctor that says, "Have you ever considered?" And you go, "Oh, I hadn't, but like now I am." And then you're told to like try it on, right? You're like, okay, we'll try living as a guy for um a bit, see how that feels. What does that mean?
It means like
Nothing really.
practice dissociating in this way for a week and come back and tell us how you feel. And then you dissociate enough and you're like, okay, it's kind of working, but you know it would really help all of the like the things, all of the signifiers that I'm with I need the costume to match the dissociation. So it's insane. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you go off and you try living as, you know, the experimental phase. And then everyone socially affirms you and tells you, "Oh my gosh, this is great. You're so brave.
Oh my
You're
God. Yeah, it's insane. We can laugh at it. You can laugh at it now. Yeah.
it's insanity. And then, you know, so your peers are giving you a second chance. Your peers are going, oh, so that's what was wrong with you. Like, welcome back to society. Welcome back under this new name. And you're young and not able to distinguish between the like validation of your peers versus the like this is a true innate state of being that I should occupy. And then you get put on testosterone, which is an upper, which makes you feel better, which makes your body stronger, which makes you, uh, you know, my eating disorder, like loved that because I put on a lot of muscle, lost a lot of fat. And then you're already on, once you're on the path, it is very hard. There's no exits. There's no off ramp. And being such in the passenger seat as I was at, I mean, being young, being
Mhm.
on substances I shouldn't have been on, being despondent, it was so easy to sit in the passenger seat. There was so much work done for me that I've had to fight really hard to undo going backwards that no one is helping me with. Like clinics, etc., made it very easy for you to just show up and be like, I'm transitioning, and they will push the surgery on you. They'll find you an endocrinologist. They'll find you like name change forms real fast. It won't cost you anything because they've got all these like micro grants that they don't even tell you about. I've been having to find the ones to use to go the other way, and most of it's been
Mm.
coming out of my own pocket this time.
I have a question about the health insurance element of it. So were you on, like when I was at RISD, I was still on my mom's health insurance plan. Were you on your parents' health insurance plan or were you on the school's health insurance plan?
I think I was on my dad's insurance. I'm
Okay.
like 99% sure I was on my dad's insurance at that point, yeah. But it was caps that, started the whole thing.
Hmm.
So, and so I got on to I said, "Oh my God, I don't want to be a woman." Within like a year, less than a year, I was like in all these support groups that were affirming, the therapist that was affirming, uh, was being socially affirmed, got hooked up with an endocrinologist. Within 6 months after that, I hated binding because I naturally had double D breasts. Like my whole life, it had been a little bit of a struggle to balance like ballet with my body type, um, which is fine, by the way. Oh my gosh. Like since detransitioning, I am like so okay with my body the way it was, the way it is. Like I've gained a lot of weight from the hormones and I'm okay. Like I'm fine with it. Like I'm so grateful for the body that I have, but that wasn't the message I got growing up, like you're told your breasts are aesthetic. So that was the relationship that the male plastic surgeon, had to my breasts, and that was the relationship I had to my breasts because I internalized that they're not a functioning organ to feed your children. They're not a useful component to sustaining humanity. They are a physical object for male sexual gratification, and they're a signifier of everything you don't want to be. So top surgery came next pretty quickly. And I remember vaguely like joking or not so joking conversations about, well, you can just get implants later. Like you can always, that is not the same thing. I have implants now. I am looking for a better alternative because they hurt. I can feel something unnatural in my body and I don't like it. There's certain motions I cannot do, and I would value the function of my body over aesthetics at this point. Um, so yeah, they just that ideology, or even maybe just our culture, maybe just
Hmm.
misogyny, has like really flattened the experience of being a woman to an aesthetic one. And yeah, so I guess I did catch up on how I got where I got.
I
The school
can I
definitely didn't help.
the school, yeah,
Yeah.
can I respond to a couple things you said before we keep going? First of all, you communicate so clearly, and it's obvious that you've had like time to really just look at everything. And I think you opening with, sharing with me and everyone listening that you were adopted, I think is also really powerful. And that's not something that's come up explicitly, I think, so far in the women that I've interviewed and the women that I work with. But, on my platform, I do talk a lot about surrogacy and the harms of surrogacy. Adoption, the industry is a bit, there's a lot of overlap, but it's a bit more complicated, but or just different. There are different issues, some similar, some differences. But when you were talking about, wanting to remove your breasts too, I imagine there's also like the disconnection from the mother, like because, and then this is not to say women who uh were breastfed by their mothers like wouldn't also be vulnerable to the trans agenda, but there's something about the severing of that mammalian like connection, that like repeat of that trauma, that I think is interesting, heartbreaking, and also maybe relevant here. Um and that identity confusion, going to that point of origin rather than, the first time you went on Tumblr, or something. I think that's a really powerful observation and connection that you've made. And then the other points about, well, yeah, I resonate with what you've shared about going to RISD, and we're using the acronym that stands for Rhode Island School of Design. It's a rigorous, I would say it's probably the, other than Cooper Union, it's probably the top art school in the US. And there is a level, or at least when I was there, I can definitely relate to the level of pressure, and the culture of the school is drug heavy, drinking heavy, hard living. Like it all-nighters, like it's part of the plight, like the artist plight. But it's ironic because most people's parents are spending, it's unless you're on a scholarship, your parents are forking over a lot of money for you to have this like poor artist persona lifestyle in this context. And so there's so many layers of it. But yeah, there's a lot of money in the school that goes into the school. They get a lot of funding. There's a lot of waste, I think, also. And I think that was hard for me to like reckon with. Yeah. So and I wanted to add that my eating disorders and mental health, I think, reached an all-time low when I was at RISD as well. And again, this is not all RISD's fault, but there's something about that environment and I think the college experience and being a woman in that environment, which is really, it's really demanding and it's really difficult. And my reasons for going on antidepressants were food related. I had seen a couple friends take Wellbutrin and lose a lot of weight. And I thought, I want to go on Wellbutrin and lose weight. Like, I want to feel better. I want to stop binge eating, but that wasn't my experience on it. So, so yeah, that it's kind of already embedded in the culture. And I'm sure maybe it's worse at like more frat sorority heavy environments. But, and then my question for you is like, what were the responses of your teachers at the time? Was everyone just like totally affirming and like,
Yeah, it's something I think about now that I'm looking at it all through fresh eyes, through deprogramming. I think there were certainly and still are people who have figured out that this is an ideology that can benefit a lot of people in a lot of ways. At the time, I think it was new. My class seemed to be like one of the first classes that were like really, oh gosh, the most insufferable.
mm,
We want it our way and we want it now because I mean, historically, this ideology really seems to have sprung up as a horizontally spread through a singular generation as opposed to top down, passed on from elders.
mm,
So it was like always kind of like the kids running the show. I feel like our class really started to be one of the first classes that was like bullying professors into
oh, wow.
quote like
Yeah.
respecting like the ideology, like praying to our gods, right? Like um and I'm fairly embarrassed about some of the behavior that I was told to emulate. um I wrote actually a letter to one of my professors that was an apology. It was a queer theory professor at RISD, so I also took queer theory classes at Brown. Ironically, before I got grabbed by the cult. Before that, I was taking queer theory and I was saying some very gender critical stuff. I was saying, why are women the ones that have to yield our language? Why, and it went completely unaddressed by my male professor in the class. I remember writing this essay clearly now because it's become culturally relevant on like a very outside of academia way. But I was writing some pretty turfy stuff in that class, and like nobody was addressing it because it wasn't like hitting that bell. It wasn't saying the right thing. But I wasn't being shamed for it either, and no one was calling it like, "Oh, you're a turf because you say this," because that concept wasn't really around then. Um, but I was seeing it clearly, and then I wasn't seeing it clearly, and then I was taken in, and
Mm,
that to me is so disturbing. The fact that I could have an honest response and then I could have a conditioned response. But I did end up writing an apology letter to one of my professors because he was saying, historically, he was an older man who was probably at Stonewall. Like, I don't know all of his, I feel like he was. I don't want to say that for sure without knowing, but um, he uh, he was telling the class like there's a difference between LGB and T, and like these things can overlap, but like a woman can't be like a gay man. But he wasn't saying it that explicitly. He was just
mm,
saying that like
mm,
factually. I was having a fucking crisis because I was being told like you're a gay, like you are a gay male and trans. And so, like, I remember this conversation I was having with him where I was really upset after class one day, and I was like explaining to him, our generation doesn't want to be seen as trans too. We just want to be seen as gay men as well. Like, it was very, I don't know. It was very, but yeah, I wrote him a letter, and we're friends now. We talk.
Oh my God, that's
So
amazing. Oh, I love that. That's so cool. That is
yeah.
so cool. That is really awesome. Oh gosh, I don't know if I could contact. I've thought about who could I contact. I mean, they were all just like, there was one professor that I had who laid the groundwork for, like, he could have been called a queer theorist. Like, I mean, I'm sure he is now, but at the time he was just gender nonconforming, and we were reading a lot of, wait, we actually read some trans memoirs, like a trans identified man. I think we read a memoir. Like, the reading list was out of control, trans indoctrination, but it wasn't called that at the time. I was really fascinated by transhumanism
Mm.
in the race capacity, like transracialism, my senior year. So my senior thesis was all about the, like, romanticizing a universe where a culture where we would choose our race and kind of like slip it on and slip it off, daily, and be like in this AI kind of reality. I remember a Native American Indian professor, painting professor. I don't know if he's still there. Remember him kind of pushing up against a little bit, but like the bullshit that they tolerated that I was spewing, like in the name of art. Like, I don't think I was like doing anything that like actually caused a material harm at the time, but because it was living in like an abstraction, but I was basically like imagining a transhumanist reality back in 2013. And also, my sophomore year, I did a whole semester's worth of work on Venus Extravaganza, one of the drag queens featured in the documentary Paris is Burning, where I just fetishized and like romanticized the plight of these male prostitutes. But again, it wasn't about transgender. Like, there was no transgenderism, trans idea. Like, it wasn't in that framework. It was all about like pushing the boundaries of identity. Like, I was doing work all around my identity, the identity of others. Yeah, I imagine even at that point there was no pushback, and there was only like support. My point in sharing that was like, I've thought about, okay, who do I have any allies? Like, who would I reach out to? Because there were these like badass female professors that I had. But I fear I'm 99% sure they're all totally captured, and why would they reveal themselves to me? It's just, I don't know. Okay, so all and what's also crazy about your story is that, like, meanwhile you were like producing work, you had deadlines. Like, what kind of art were you making? What was your major?
Oh boy. I switched majors like four times.
Oh my
I switched majors
gosh.
as many times as you were allowed to. So I started out as a photo major. That was kind of like how I got into the school. They like wanted more photo people, so I was like, sick, I can do that. Love the darkroom. And then I went on to teach photography after that, so that's fun. It worked out. But I started as a photo major. And then I moved to animation because I kind of like I ended up doing more video work than still image work. And so I was like, well, why don't I just hop over to FAV? Like, that'll be convenient. And then I was like, wow, I don't want to work in commercial like anything. Like, this is awful. And then I was like, what is open media? Because they had like FAV had just introduced this open media that was more studio driven movement. It was like moving image in the studio
Mhm.
as opposed to on the screen or commercially. And I was like, that's cool. That's everything. And then I started making lenses for my camera in the hot shop, and I was like, glass. That's it. But they wouldn't let me switch to, to glass at that time. So I just stayed in open media and took advantage of its open in the title. So I ended up doing like some like really kind of early stages like Oculus animation, which was an amazing opportunity. Like, I think about like some of the opportunities I got there, the software, just like the people like there were some really incredible opportunities that came out of RISD. Wish I could have finished it as myself, but that's my own personal regrets. But the work really did kind of mirror the chaos that was going on. Like when I was a photo major, I did this really cringy series that was like all photos I took while I was blackout drunk,
Oh my
like wanting to be
gosh.
the yeah, like wanting to be like the next, I don't know, Dash Snow or something. Like
Wow.
I think that was in the air in general, but then I also like fell into that. And yeah, that was, and then I did a lot of kind of like identity. You had to make identity work at the time. I hope it's changing. Like I think it's changing. I'm tangentially involved in the art world now. I make functional glass. I make pipes. I have kind of tiptoed back into fine art through plasma work, but it's producing challenges for me now, just because having deprogrammed and then also having this like PTSD. I've literally been diagnosed with PTSD from the cult, from the medicalization of my body, the encouraged dysphoria that every procedure they do just makes the dysphoria worse because there's like this. I wish I could draw a graph of this like approaching. So say the goal is to be male, like the goal is to be male, which for me it was. The goal was never to be trans. The goal was never to be like anywhere in between. It was like to be male. And I was told that was possible. First lie. That's something I tell doctors now. Make sure that your patients know that they are capable of simulating the appearance of the opposite sex, but never becoming it. Because that one distinction would have saved me this whole trouble. But
Mm.
so if the goal is to become male, you like get on testosterone and you're like, oh, happy. And then you like get top surgery and you're like, oh, that's closer. And then you get approved for phalloplasty and you're like, oh, that's closer. And then you have phalloplasty and you're like, I can never get a woman pregnant. And you like really start seeing like that gap that then is just this gap that it will never touch. Like the reality, there's the hole there.
It's interesting you say like you had to kind of do identity work at that time. Like in Mike, like I was in painting, and at that time, painting was the do whatever you want major. Like my peers were like, if you were still painting landscapes and painting, we were like lame, boring. Like we were all doing like a lot of us were doing performance oriented sculptural stuff, like video stuff, like multimedia, like mixed. It should have been called mixed media, but it was painting. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think a handful of us we were doing identity stuff, but I think mine was probably the most overtly identity politics centered. And it's interesting to hear that by the time you were like your RISD career had taken off, it was kind of that was everybody was doing it. No
Yeah,
landscape painters, no like
that would have been so revolutionary.
yeah.
um, I felt it, and I don't know. I'm a little bit wary of talking on this specific topic just because I have my own opinions on it, and I don't need to be canceled in another way. But I feel like so Black Lives Matter was happening during my time at RISD, and we had a lot of conversations on the campus that were really, I mean, potentially rightfully so. I have no ability to speak on this, but that were very much privileging the voices of the students in a really wildly unchecked way.
Mm.
So we had a lot of students who were hurting and needed guidance, hurting around racial issues, to be clear, and really needed guidance. But instead of getting, my perception from the outside is that instead of getting help from a mentor or anything, they were just angry, rightfully, but given a platform to be angry with no guardrails at all.
Mm.
So there was a lot of blame on other students. And I do think that was a factor in why you ended up with like 27 they them women by the time we graduated.
Right. Right.
Um, they them white women. Let me be clear about that. And obviously, I'm not saying that that isn't work that should have been done and conversations that should have been had, but as an adult now and as an educator looking at it from the outside, I'm like, we all collectively really needed some guidance. We really needed an adult in the room to
Go ahead.
mitigate accidental harm to other students. Um, because they ended up, it was almost like yeah, it wasn't productive, but it did to feed back into the identity work was really, really praised and also somewhat untouchable. So if you like wanted to win critique,
Mm.
and you had any other in your identity, you could just take that other, whatever it is, make work about that, and then kind of tell the professor you can't talk about this because you're not XYZ. So I think that like fed into it. It was just a whole mess.
Oh my gosh, I'm having so many flashbacks of critique and deadlines and thesis and just all of it. Yeah, the unchecked that's wild. And it reminds me of like kind of what happened at Evergreen. I don't know if you followed that. Benjamin Boyce has a channel and he made like a 20-part series on what happened at a college in Washington State where the students like locked their like professors in a room. Like it turned into a
Oh,
full-blown like riots and violence and just that kind of what can happen when the student body goes like totally unchecked and rampant and just runs wild, and the police were involved. Like it was this whole saga around the same time as I think when you were maybe a junior or senior at RISD. But yeah, I think my professors were pretty ruthless. We didn't have it that bad when I was there. But okay, so by the time you were a senior at RISD, you had a double mastectomy and had been on testosterone. Is that right?
yes.
So then you graduate,
Mhm.
and then what happens? Like, can you talk about the time between that and then the ideology starting to unravel for you?
Yeah. Well, all right. So looking back on it, really only dug into and believed the ideology for as long as it took for me to get my tits chopped off. Like I really was only
Mm.
taken by it for like 6 months. That was long enough. That was long enough. I started to see the issues with it when I would show up to support groups at school still. I would show up to support groups expecting to be in a room with other quote trans guys to talk about like material issues I was having. Like,
Mm.
hey, did testosterone do this weird thing to you? Like I want some support in that. Or, hey, what has your experience been like being seen by some people who are queer illiterate as men? And like, how are we coping? And I would show up to these support groups and it would be like me, one other transitioned person, and then a bunch of what I called ideologically trans people. And this was before we started using the word ideology. This was just like me using my stupid big brain, like trying to come up with a way to explain what was happening to people. So it'd be like me, one other transitioned person, and then like a whole gaggle of they thems that were fairly gender conforming. So that was my it was through going through it that I saw the cracks in the structure. I also always considered myself when I was transitioned to be like trans medicalist and true trans and all of those things. I was never really for any significant amount of time non-binary or I used they right before I used he because it I was so obviously not a he that I just used they. I still used the women's room until it became too hard to use the women's room, and then I used the men's room. Like it was like a very literal interpretation of transitioning. And so after I graduated, I went back to my hometown and just did not talk about it. I got a new job where people did not know my history. I eventually ended up getting I worked out of a glass blowing shop where people did not know my history. and I was assumed to be a cis man by these incredibly queer literate dude bros who did not let women into their studio. So that was a trippy experience for me, seeing the behind the curtain of boys
Wow.
clubs, and that I think that might have also traumatized me, to be honest.
Wow.
Just like having the shop manager say to my face, "We can't have women in the shop." Just misguided male perspective. And I would go to like men's meetings for AA because it didn't make sense for me to go to women's
That's
meetings at that point.
wild. I didn't know that AA meetings were like sex separated and sex segregated in that. Interesting. Okay, so you were going to male AA meetings where they're just like, you're an alcoholic man, but having no idea that you were also a trans identified woman. Okay.
Yeah. Um, the situation I was in, occasionally people would know. Like I lived stealthily. I didn't mention it. I didn't talk about the ideology. I was not in the cult. I did not have very many trans friends. I like intentionally distanced myself from it because I was like, this is crazy. But my cope was to say, that's crazy. I am true trans. That's crazy. I am transsexual. That's crazy. I
Mm.
am different. I am special. This is biological for me. I was told by a doctor that this is biological. I was told by a doctor that that was my biological reality. Um, Talk about like not trusting professional doctors anymore. I really don't. But yeah. So after graduation, I got sober. I moved home. I Right before I got sober, did end up in a mental hospital because that's how bad I got. I was not functioning. I was having panic attacks every day. The testosterone made my anxiety really, really bad. Physically, I felt good until I didn't. Physically, I felt good until I started having like heart issues
My
and
God.
yeah. Um, so I ended up healing myself a little bit in that way, and then I ended up getting into the program, and I swear the program helped deprogram me because we talk about turning ourselves over to a higher power. We talk about ego, and I know that my ego run rampant was transitioning. Um, it taught me a lot of fundamental taking responsibility for your actions, kind of all of this stuff. But at this point, I was also so far gone. Like I was just living as like a normal guy in my mind. But like the thing is, you can live as a normal guy up to a certain point. The certain point being, what am I going to do now? Get married and have kids? Like I couldn't even really date people because I was unwilling to tell them I was trans. Like I was unwilling to cross
Mm.
that boundary and cross that line because trans didn't feel accurate to me. But also there was no easy way out. You know, I'd already had my voice. I lost my singing voice. I used to be in the a cappella group at school. I lost. There was so much loss and so much buy-in at that point that it did not feel possible to leave. I broke. It was a breaking for me that I got out of it. I turned 25. My brain finished developing. I started to see the world more clearly. I also could not really abide by that gap anymore, that gap between reality and how I was living. And I just gave into it. The pandemic happened and I got fired from my job that I was working. So I didn't have that social responsibility to like keep up continuity or anything.
Mhm.
And it was scary. It was so scary because I could not find any detransitioners or like untransitioners or like we didn't even have the word detransitioner. So I remember going to my adoptive parents' house one day and talking to my mother and just sobbing and being like, "Can I stop?" Like I don't know why I felt the
Mm.
need to I needed to ask, like, "Can I stop this?" And she was like, "What?" And I'm like, "Everything." And she was like, "Of course you can."
Aw.
So yeah, and it was a spiritual awakening too. Like I will say in the big book in A, they talk about having a spiritual awakening where you are relieved of your obsessions. And to me, this was that. It was like scales falling away from my eyes. And I was really happy for a short period of time until I started until I started looking female and getting treated female. And I had a year there where watching people lose respect for me, watching men start to talk over me, stopping being asked my opinion, making less money from my sales. I make a third what I made as a beginner glassblower because this is my interface instead of some dude. I will acknowledge that my industry is particularly sexist, like especially sexist. And healing has been my focus now because I do have PTSD from the double mastectomy. I have PTSD from being lied to by doctors, being told this is a cure, this will make your life better, this is the right thing to do, this has been tested. Like the fact that they didn't ever acknowledge this is experimental treatment. We are experimenting on people, primarily women at this point, by the way. So I'm not gonna lie, my life has gotten harder just in the I'm a little bit I'm stuck. I'm a little bit stuck. I tried to send myself back to school specifically for glass blowing. I went back and I was like, this is cool. I've been healing my body for a year and a half. I don't get questioned anymore. I don't look male. Like, this is a fresh start. I walk into my first classroom. The teacher introduces herself, and we have to do a pronoun circle. And the teacher goes to each person and there's like a 75-year-old grandpa in this class and she's like, what are your pronouns? And he's like, I don't know. Like, I'm a dude.
Veteran.
And yeah, actually,
Is
right.
that what he said?
No, but he was a vet. But like, yeah, so she's they by the way, they were making us go around the room doing pronouns and very condescendingly was like, this is what a pronoun is, and you're all going to do it. And it's important to do it. And like beating us over the head with her personal religion that is a cope for all of the sexual abuse she's been through. And I know this because I've seen her artwork. Like I've seen her work. I know what it's about. It's about motherhood and sexual abuse. I'm just like, girl. And not only that, but we had one student in there who was a 18-year-old girl who wanted to go by a male name who was starting to question. And at one point in the class, this is a fucking glass blowing class, by the way. We are not talking, this is not a gender ideology class. And we're in the hot shop and she's demoing. And this kid is like, I've been thinking about top surgery. And she goes, me too. And I had a fucking panic attack. The world was just like, what it, so like I escaped the cult only for the rest of the world to be taken in by it. And that's where I am now. I am trying to heal from being told that the sky is green and the grass is blue, but the rest of the world is shaming me for that. And the rest of the world now thinks that the sky is green and the grass is blue. So it's always a relief when I find people like you online. Like my friend, I think my friend Amanda was the one who was like, you have to talk to this person like forever ago. And I was like, okay. So like it's always nice to meet other people who are founded in reality. And to that point, I towed the line when I detransitioned of gender ideology. I was a good little detransitioner and got on TikTok and would just be like, I'm making content for other detransitioners, but everybody's gender journey is different. Blah, blah, blah. Like I was being
Mm,
very diplomatic
mm,
because I wanted my content to be accessible to the people who needed it to find a door. Boy, did that change in, in 2 years. I got tired of being, it didn't matter what I said. I got called a turf. I got called, like, I got threats to my physical safety. Like, it did not matter what I said. They were waiting for me to trip up and they were waiting for me to say something where they could just, and I don't think that was the healthiest choice for me to try to continue to make work like that. I've stepped away from TikTok. I've deleted the app. I'm moving towards this kind of format. And also, I've been writing, so I'll be publishing some writing soon. But the thing that shifted my perspective, so I was being diplomatic, right? And then I was in a church like spiritual seekers group, and I'd had a really bad day where I went to the gym and I got my picture taken by this some dude. I'd had a guy at a gas station like get in my face, and I'd had a buyer just blow me off because I'm a girl. So I'd had like a particularly frustrating day. And I show up to the group and it's all women that day. And I was like, I just wanted to say how grateful I am that it's all women today because I really needed this. And the leader of the group kind of like looks around like shiftily and like catches the eye of the woman next to her. And I was like, can we do this on purpose sometime? Like, can we have a women's group? And they were like, I guess we could have like a non-men's group. And I was like, the house is on fire, y'all. The house is on fucking fire. Like I came back to womanhood and what I'm doing is filling myself with positivity of trying to find strong women to be around, to affirm and to like fill that gap with something. And I've gotten back into this group and women are afraid to say the word woman. And I wanted to scream. And that's kind of when I was peaked. Like I stopped being
Mm.
diplomatic. I was like, fuck this. Women should have spaces that we can not, be safe in, like physically where we know where it's just females. Like all of that stuff, I was no longer afraid to say it because this has affected women's spaces. It has not affected men. No men, when I was living in that world, were having these conversations. Nobody was talking about gender. Nobody was talking about trans this, trans that. Nobody was talking about any of that stuff because it doesn't affect men. It affects women detrimentally.
It's like yeah, I mean, you're like fighting for your sanity. Like it is essential that, I mean, yeah, it makes sense that you would abandon like neutrality. I had this conversation with a friend recently and we were talking about like the degrees of turfdom, and she kind of jokingly was like, "Oh yeah, she's a new turf. She believes in neutrality. She's still trying out neutrality. That's like early turfdom, the spectrum of early turfdom,
Hmm.
which yeah, is kind of what you were describing with trying to be diplomatic. And I've spoken to other formerly trans-identified women who said the same thing of wanting to reach, you know, the audience that they think needs it, but as you described, like they're always, the people in the cult just are sniffing for where you're turfy. And if you're not totally compliant, you've done it wrong. And so there's no, yeah, this is the myth of neutrality or believing in true trans or just sticking to the medicalization aspect, I know is another strategy. But when you were describing like the school and the teacher and the 18-year-old, I just imagined you being like I don't know what I would do in your shoes, but like I had this like if I felt safe enough and they were all women, I may have just like taken up my shirt and been like, this is what this looks like. Like like just taking it out of the abstraction into the material of like, this is what you're looking at. This is the reality of your like fantasy, the fantasy in your mind. Yeah, just bringing people back into the material, but certainly a challenging thing to navigate, especially when you're still invested in that institution. I imagine it's difficult to keep entering those spaces and not speaking. We talk a lot about like, what you can lose and the consequences, but like maybe not enough emphasis on, and when I say we, I just mean like culturally, not enough emphasis on the cost of staying quiet, like on a physical, emotional, spiritual
Yeah,
level.
I was not prepared. I also thought I was getting a fresh start,
Mm,
and I did not want to jeopardize. I really internalized like, don't talk about this, you will be outcast.
mm,
And, it's true. There are, I'd actually be really interested in doing another conversation with you at some point, specifically about the art world and the ideology, because I have several things I want to say that I cannot say yet because I am still doing investigation. Um,
mm.
But there were extenuating circumstances on why I did not feel safe saying anything. And part of what I want to work towards for detransitioners, because there's about to be a whole lot of us that have needs that are counter to what is being touted as the correct way of being. One of the things that I really want to advocate for detransitioners is being able to opt out without moral shame from pronoun circles or being pressured to acknowledge people's realities that are not the same reality that you have. Like, we should not have to do that. When we're recovering from the cult, we absolutely should not have to do that.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult that must be to not, yeah, because even withdrawing, there's no, it's everywhere now. I mean, I'm sure there are communities, like, I'm in the Freebirth Society. It's an online membership, lots of radical women. No one in that space is buying into this bullshit. Like, there are spaces online, and then, we meet up in person, and we have the annual, Matriarch Rising Festival. So there are spaces. That's my plug for everyone to join the membership and come to the festival in June. So I'm certainly in circles and spaces and like that, but I also do not have an employer. I don't go to school every day to some institution. I mean, yeah, it's a definitely, it takes a lot of careful planning and time, I think, as well, to create a life for yourself where your values are reinforced by the people that you're with. I mean, when I go to New York City, I live in Texas now, but when I go to New York, it's really devastating just to be in like the NYU area or around Union Square, or to be in Brooklyn, just like the hubs where I just see so many women with their scars and men in full fetish gear, and just young, yeah, just young, really young people.
So I am in a support group for detrans women, and I polled them last time we were all together about alternatives to transition, to medical transition, to ease the feelings of discomfort one might call dysphoria, might call being a woman in this society, might call dysmorphia, all of that. And I got some really good answers from them. Things that have worked for me, spirituality, having something greater than myself that fills that faith void, getting also in tune with my body, yoga and things that ground me are very instrumental in this healing process for me. Being able to acknowledge my reality, my physical reality. Radical acceptance has been a big one for me. Radical acceptance of the situation I've been born into that I cannot change. Yeah, it's that. And then some of the things that the women in this group said. One of them uses the tactic of looking in the mirror and treating herself like a woman that she loves. That
mm,
compat the compassion and that love, even writing love letters to herself, to her mind, to her body, to who she, there's, respect of who she is as a person. Another one said something similar, looking at her natural body in the mirror, naked, and just hanging out and being present with herself naked in a non sexual way, just doing things around the house, getting comfortable with herself in that way. And meditation came up a lot for a lot of the women, talking about various kinds of meditation. So, yeah, there are alternatives and resources, and we who detransitioned are working pretty hard to make doors, make exits for the people who are going to need it, make a soft place for them to land. So hopefully we move towards that.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or family member who needs to hear this content. And if you do share it on social media, don't forget to follow and tag me at Whose Body Is It? So until next time.